Every day, so I'm looking a little crazy, so I'm gonna use a filter, you know what I'm saying? But in all seriousness, I'm really disappointed in Amanda Serrano and her management, her promoter, whoever is on her team. You're a 9-time, 9-division or 7-division world champion, whatever it is. I'm close enough. And now you're fighting someone who's on a losing streak and who you stopped in the first round, who isn't even on your league. But you turn down a better fight for money, but you accept that fight. And then like 6 or 7 of her belts were for a vacant belt. You're not even fighting champions. This is part of the problem. Yes, I said it because it's so frustrating. I'm only 2-0, so I'm not there yet. But trust me, all of these women at the top, when I get there, I'm going to fight them because I'm not going to worry about looking good and padding my record and going for vacant. And for all of y'all who are going to be like, stop hating, support women's boxing. I do. I support women's boxing, but when it makes sense. Either you're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. So when do we step up and say enough is enough if we want better pay and televised time? I mean, what y'all think? Tell me. I want to hear what y'all think. I want to hear your opinion. And if it's stupid, keep it to yourself, because then I don't. I got time today. What's up?
That is Melissa Oddessa chiming in on what is to be Amanda Serrano's very next fight, a so obvious tune-up fight that involves a certain level of frivolity, as it is a little bit frivolous, a little bit vulgar, to take on Diana Santana again when you've already beaten this fighter, you've already knocked out this fighter. To Melissa Oddessa's point, this kind of fight does nothing for the sport of women's boxing and nothing for Amanda Serrano. You know, I didn't even want to broach this subject because I didn't want to enter into yet another episode of me being critical of Amanda Serrano for fear that I might be overly critical, appear overly critical of this fighter and how this fighter's career is being handled, how it's being managed. But you see that the criticism isn't even coming from me this time. It's not coming from a boxing fan. It's coming from a boxer. So what the hell are you supposed to say? What the hell are you supposed to say when a fighter like Amanda Serrano walks away from a Katie Taylor fight because supposedly she didn't like the money and she didn't like the venue and she wants to be paid what she's worth, yet this is the kind of opponent that she's keeping busy with, an opponent that she beat already, an opponent that's coming off of 3 consecutive losses and is 1-5 in their last 6, has only won 1 of their last 6 fights and is coming off of 3 consecutive losses.
Jesus.
5 losses in their last 6 fights. What the hell are you supposed to say? And I understand that Amanda Serrano has big plans for 2021. I actually support that endeavor. She wants to unify the featherweight division in the coming year, and she's trying to tune up in preparation of that. But what makes this particularly frivolous, to the point where it's just vulgar, is that you've actually fought Diana Santana before, and you've actually knocked her out before. Like I said, I tried to approach this news with a bit of understanding. We are still in COVID times in the sport of women's boxing. Sometimes opponents aren't as accessible as they are in men's boxing because there isn't always as big a pool to choose from. I thought about all these things, and I wasn't going to say anything about this. I really wasn't. But when I saw Melissa Oddessa's post, that this wasn't coming from an overly critical pundit or an overly critical boxing fan, when I saw that this was coming from an actual boxer, I couldn't help but talk about it because I'm in agreement. This does nothing for the sport of women's boxing. It's not a good advertisement.
In some ways, it makes it look bad.
The New York-based boxer, Melissa Oddessa, who is trained by Andre Rosier and managed by his management company, Havoc Management, echoed many of the sentiments we express here on the channel that, you know, maybe this is okay for a prospect who's climbing up the ranks and needs to garner experience, but for a fighter who runs around telling every man, woman, and his dog that she's a 7-division champion, surely you could have did something better than this. You could have found someone better than this.
And it doesn't help that she walked away from a super fight.
And I guess that's what makes this particularly egregious. That here you have a fighter who claims that she was being shortchanged by Eddie Hearn, who offered her a career-high purse, 6 figures, in a fight, a super fight, that she walked away from. A fight that surely would have done more for the sport of women's boxing than this. And, what the hell are you supposed to say when an up-and-comer is taking on better competition than a 7-division champion who's been in the sport since 2009? What are you supposed to say when you got to fight a Shannon Courtenay, for example, who's fought 2 times this year, at least 2 times? And those opponents were more formidable opponents than who Amanda Serrano is about to take on. Shannon, she took on Rachel Ball. She lost the fight. She fought one more time.
Against Norek.
She had the fight with Norek, and she bounced back all before the year was out. What's Amanda Serrano doing? Amanda Serrano's fighting a gal who's 1-5 in the last 6 fights. So what the hell are you supposed to say? And in today's day and age, if you point out this kind of stuff, if you iterate these truths and the overall frivolity of them, you're going to get guys out there that accuse you of hating. Oh, you're hating! That's what you're doing by pointing out how egregious this really is.
What the hell is this supposed to do for the sport?
And what the hell is this supposed to do for Amanda Serrano's marquee value? I mean, if the goal is to increase your marquee value so that you can demand bigger purses from these different promoters that are out there, how is fighting Diana Santana going to help you do that?
Again.
I understand that this is merely a prelude to the unification matches, what I hope are the unification matches Amanda participates in 2021. But you gotta admit, this really isn't a good look. It's not a good look for Amanda, and it's not a good look for the sport of women's boxing. It just isn't.
And this time it's not just me pointing it out.
It's Melissa Oddessa, who I've actually spoken to before here on the channel. For those interested in that interview, I'll leave the link to it in the description box. You gotta admit, Melissa has a point. You're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. Heavyweight news per a tweet from The Athletic. If the WBO don't want to be involved in the biggest fight in boxing, then unfortunately, we would have to vacate the title. It would be a travesty because all we want is the undisputed fight. And that is a quote from Eddie Hearn in reference to the ongoing situation between Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, the fight they're trying to make, and the fight that Alexander Usyk, the WBO's mandatory challenger, stands in the way of. Paco Veracel saw this tweet, decided to respond by saying, "Is this the same Eddie Hearn, my friend, who talked to us in New York when Anthony Joshua got beaten by Andy Ruiz?"
Ouch.
Essentially what Paco is hinting at is that the WBO did Eddie Hearn a favor. They allowed Anthony Joshua the opportunity to fight for that title, didn't force a mandatory, and they allowed him to satisfy his IBF mandatory challenger without incident. But at this point, they don't feel like affording him those same opportunities anymore. Ultimately, it falls on Alexander Usyk to either stand down or push for his mandated title shot. I told you guys, I don't think he's going to stand down. The funniest thing about this situation is, even if everything on the matchroom side could be sorted out, if by some chance Alexander Usyk could be convinced to stand down and not push for the mandatory, leave the road clear for the undisputed heavyweight title fight, and you go ahead and challenge the winner, even if all of that were already sorted, I'm still not convinced that Tyson Fury would go into the Anthony Joshua undisputed heavyweight title fight off of 12 months of inactivity, because in all likelihood, that's what the case would be. That if the fight is staged sometime in the spring, March, April, it will have been 12 months since Tyson Fury had a fight. And I'm sorry for saying that I don't believe he'd walk into that Joshua fight under those circumstances. Do you? Eddie Hearn's talk of potentially vacating the WBO title to make the Tyson Fury fight isn't in keeping with all of Anthony Joshua's talk of collecting all the belts and effectively unifying the division, all of Anthony Joshua's legacy talk. This is a situation where you take one step forward just to take one step back, or one step back just to take one step forward.
It's the same shit.
I mean, the whole reason that Anthony Joshua's focus shifted from fighting Deontay Wilder to fighting Tyson Fury is because the green belt changed hands. Now Fury is in possession of it, giving Anthony Joshua the incentive to go after him as opposed to Deontay Wilder. So what's he gonna do? He's gonna go after Tyson Fury, go after his belt, if it means sacrificing one of his own? Eddie Hearn himself always says that, Anthony Joshua doesn't work for him. He works for Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua is the boss. And it sounds a lot like Anthony Joshua is focused on unifying the division, and you can't do that if you sacrifice one of your belts. What's he gonna do? Take one step forward just to take one step back? In Anthony Joshua's own words, the Usyk fight is likelier to happen than the Tyson Fury fight. I'll tell you the truth. I'm okay with either of those fights. I'm okay with either of those scenarios being the very next scenario that we see. If Anthony Joshua wants to satisfy his mandatory in Usyk, go for it. If he's willing to sacrifice the title to face Tyson Fury in his very next fight, hey, I'm okay with that too. But as far as what I think is likelier than not, I'd sooner believe that Joshua faces Alexander Usyk than Tyson Fury in his very next fight.
That's how it looks to me.
Because I reiterate, it's not just the Joshua, Matchroom, WBO stuff that needs to be sorted out. There's also the Tyson Fury stuff that needs sorting out.
Yeah, right, he's gonna fight Anthony Joshua off a year layoff.
Moving on, this past weekend, Puerto Rican prospect Edgar Berlanga was in action on the undercard of the Stevenson versus Clary fight, and Edgar racked up his 16th professional victory, his 16th professional knockout. He is really beating the fucking shit out of these guys, and I like what I'm seeing. I like the combination punching, the aggression, the power of Edgar Berlanga. He shows a lot of promise. He really does. And he's only 23 years old. Kid with a lot of upside. Good dimensions for this weight. He campaigns at 168 pounds, standing in at about 6'1". The kind of guy who, somewhere down the line, could easily move into the light heavyweight division, though we're not quite there yet. That being said, Edgar's looking sensational. But he's looking sensational against this caliber of opponents, this quality of competition. And for what it's worth, I have no complaints about how they're moving him because the kid's only 16-0 and he's only 23 years old. These are more or less the kind of guys you expect to see a fighter fighting at this stage in their career.
There's nothing wrong with that.
And you know, these ain't world-class fighters that Edgar is fighting. Not that I'm expecting him to be taking on world-class fighters so soon in his career. I'm not, but better still, these ain't world-class fighters and these ain't world-class journeymen either that he's tearing through. Good number of these guys, they got decent records. You know, their records ain't upside down. They ain't got more losses than they have victories. For what it's worth, a good number of these guys actually have winning records. They're just not world-class fighters. And when you got a kid who's as big and as strong as Edgar is, you know, that power of his, it's a gift and a case. Because, you know, a fighter might get accustomed to just tearing through these guys the way that Edgar is tearing through these guys. To the point to where if one day he's confronted with a guy that can take what he has, he might start to feel like a deer in the headlights. I mean, that really is the danger. Special attention has to be placed on how the fighter is being moved. And, you know, when are you going to step him up? When is his quality of competition going to step up? And seeing everything I've seen from Edgar, I wouldn't mind if in his very next fight he went in there and took on Gabriel Rosado. I think that's the kind of opponent he's ready for. I think he's ready for a world-class journeyman like Gabriel Rosado, who looked very formidable against Daniel Jacobs. I'll tell you something. If Edgar can do to Gabriel Rosado what he just did to Ulysses Sierra, well, he'd really be making a statement, because we all just saw Gabriel Rosado in action against former middleweight champion, now super middleweight contender, Daniel Jacobs. And Daniel could not dispatch Gabriel Rosado, where we were all expecting him to dispatch Gabriel. We know Danny's a world-class fighter. So just imagine if an up-and-comer, a prospect like Edgar, were to take out Gabriel Rosado where Daniel Jacobs could not. I want to say that, you know, Edgar is managed by Havoc Management, who also manages Melissa Oddessa, who we talked about in the earlier segment. You know, he's also trained by Andre Rosier, who's doing a fantastic job with this fighter. Given everything that Edgar has shown us so far, I do happen to think in either his very next fight or 2 fights from now, a Gabriel Rosado step up in competition wouldn't be a bad idea. There's really no rush. Kid's only 16-0, 23 years old. He's got plenty of time, but, you know, that really would be something if they put him in there with Gabe. And if he did to Gabe what he just did to Ulysses.
Got my eye on this kid.
And finally, in reference to yet another Puerto Rican fighter that was in action on that same card, the Stevenson versus Clary card, we all saw that, you know, Felix Verdejo, he was upset by Masayoshi Nakatani. Masayoshi, who has been out of action for, what is it, over a year? He hasn't fought since the Teofimo Lopez fight. And, you know, Felix got off to a strong start. He did, but the fight just got away from him. And there is a fragility to Felix Verdejo that I'm not sure can be remedied, because he got hit with a hard shot between the punches, and he never recovered. Was subsequently knocked down for a second time off a big right hand from Masayoshi, who proved to be more durable, more game than perhaps he was given credit for ahead of the fight. I think if you would have asked around, most people would have told you they have Felix winning this thing, but that's just not how it happened. And with those things in mind and the current state of the 135-pound division, Devin Haney, WBC light heavyweight champion Devin Haney, he's facing a scarcity of opponents. He's supposed to get the winner of Garcia versus Campbell, though I'm not quite convinced that he will. And if you can't get the winner of that fight, and you can't get Teofimo Lopez, and you definitely can't get Gervonta Davis, I happen to think that Masayoshi Nakatani is the ideal candidate to make a statement against. And I happen to think that it could go a long way with Devin Haney's critics, of which these days he has no shortage of. I think it would go a long way with those guys if he so decided to give Masayoshi Nakatani a world title opportunity voluntarily, that perhaps to them that might legitimize his reign as a champion, as he's often referred to as an email champion. They discredit this kid's world title reign because they feel he didn't earn it. A subject that we've often broached here on the channel. It just doesn't make sense to me. In essence, all the kid was doing was lining himself up for an eventual world title shot at the then world champion Vasyl Lomachenko. He was doing the opposite of what Gervonta Davis was doing. Instead of putting distance between himself and that fighter, he was moving towards him, in a manner of speaking. And because things worked out the way that they did, which really isn't Devin Haney's fault, he gets a lot of flack. And instead of just mulling over the particulars that we've mulled over 1,000 times already, I happen to think that it would go a long way for the career of Devin Haney, his reign as a champion amongst the spectators in what is this spectator sport, if he fought someone like Masayoshi Nakatani and put on a solid performance. Masayoshi, who made Teofimo Lopez look more vulnerable than I've ever seen him. Masayoshi, who just upset plans for Felix Verdejo, seems like the ideal guy for Devin Haney to make a statement against. I don't know how realistic this fight is or isn't, but you know what? It's just a suggestion. There's one fighter that's out there who's worth fighting, who's worth beating.